would like to thank you all very much for joining us. And I would like to start by acknowledging that we are all dialing in today from the lands of traditional owners. I today am calling in from the lands of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people. And I invite everybody to share the names of the traditional owners of the lands on which they are also dialing in. Whoever lands you are dialing in for today, we all pause for a moment to stop and pay our acknowledgements to elders past and present. And I would like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining with us today. It is my sincerest pleasure to welcome Dr. Lynn Hay today here to present on the Professional Pathways in School Libraries project. As many of you would be aware, ALIA has made a deep investment in looking at future-proofing our professional frameworks for the library and information services sector. And we're doing that across a whole range. So from teacher librarians and librarians through to library technicians and library assistants, really delving into what are those core skills, knowledge and ethics, and what support people need in order to really drive our libraries forward into the future. Really early on in the project, it was identified that school libraries were a very special part of the ecosystem and really needed a specific piece of research that investigated and addressed their specific needs. And we were absolutely delighted that Dr. Lynn Hay was able to dedicate her incredible intellectual energies into undertaking this process. I'm not going to say much more about it because Lynn is much better placed to talk than I am, but I would like to introduce Lynn. She will be a familiar face to many of you, being involved in education, being an academic, being a researcher, being a consultant over a very long and illustrious career. I could not think of anybody with better experience, connections, research skills and knowledge to have undertaken this project, and we are truly grateful to have her here with us today. I'm now going to hand over to Lynn.
Thanks, Trish. Welcome, everyone. I'm not actually seeing, since I'm showing my screen, I'm not seeing the chat, so I'll be drawing upon Trish to alert me if there's any questions or burning issues or things that need to be addressed as I present today. Just to begin, I'd just like to say that it's been an absolute pleasure working with the ALIA team on this project, and just to give people a bit of context, the work that I had been working on for the last year is just one little tiny piece of a big puzzle, which is ALIA's Professional Pathways Initiative, and it's an exciting initiative where I'm really excited to see how the framework starts to develop in terms of the knowledge and skills. And if anyone is not familiar with that, this is the URL to go to the Professional Pathways website. The project report that I'm just going to be dipping into just a few pieces today because this is actually quite, it's a short seminar. But for anyone who hasn't read the report or been able to access it, if you've got a device with you, you can just scan that QR code, or you can type the tiny URL into a browser, and that will take you to where the report is stored on the ALIA website. I will admit it's a long read. From when we first started this project, I really didn't envisage such a long and lengthy report, but it just so happened that, and I think Jill Hallam has also found this with the work she's been doing with the Bigger Picture Pathways project work, is that we've just collected an enormous amount of data, and it just seemed to be an opportunity, a missed opportunity if we did not make the most of that in reporting a lot of the findings. So basically, this project, as Trish mentioned, we started off wanting to get a sense of the professional development needs and pathways of those people working in school libraries. And what I'm really excited about with this project was that we were looking at a number of employee groups who work in the school library sector. A lot of work that has been done with both ALIA and with the Australian School Library Association has focused on teacher librarians in the main as employees working in school libraries. And this was a great opportunity for us to acknowledge that we are now seeing a broadening of school library teams, and there are other employee groups working in the school library sector who need support in terms of pathways, training, education training, professional development, and so on. So the aim of this project was to be identifying the necessary skills for school library staff, and there's still a big piece of that puzzle, really, I think, that we need to be exploring once we see how the professional pathways framework is developed. Also to support the LIS course development and accreditation process in terms of the needs of school library employees, identifying potential micro-credential programs for LIS and non-LIS qualified staff, identifying CPD for the broad range of employee groups working in the school library sector, and also identifying professional learning challenges and opportunities. As I said, not just for teacher librarians, but we identified teacher librarians, library techs, library assistants, and librarians as the four main employee groups. But when we actually looked at developing the online survey, we also wanted to be targeting qualified teachers who were working in schools as well, because obviously we need to be looking at the sorts of pathways that are available to those people as well. I'd like to acknowledge the support and input and expertise and advice from the ALIA project team. And we also had an expert reference group who were valuable for me at the very beginning of this project in particular in exploring a number of the key issues that we needed to be addressing in terms of this project. So I'd just like to acknowledge everyone's input and expertise, and I really appreciate all of your involvement in the project. So in terms of the methodology of the project, there were three phases. One was an initial scoping, which was involved a review of the literature and professional documentation. Dr. Jill Hallam had already had drafted the very large professional pathways technical report, which had identified the school library context, as Trish said, as being an area that needed to be examined in its own right. And also over the period of the project, I was drawing upon policies and frameworks from professional associations and accrediting bodies, government departments, school systems, as well as role statements and school-based job descriptions. So all of that was sort of informing the project as we started this in late October of last year. As a result of that, then we needed to do further scoping and gap analysis, and that involved in the second phase. There are a number of individual interviews with key stakeholders, and there were also a series of focus groups which I held in late November through to early January of this year. We had 47 people participate in those interviews and focus groups, and that was really valuable because it really helped shape what our phase 3 part of the project looked like, and certainly helped inform the development of our professional pathways in school libraries employee survey, which we ended up having over 750 people attempt the survey. We ended up with 693 complete responses, across the different stakeholder groups. And the survey we were really trying to target specifically a defined set of employee groups. So as I said, we had 5 of those. So that was teacher librarian, teachers working in school libraries, librarians, library techs, and library assistants working in school libraries. And each of those employee groups were defined by ALIA policy in terms of qualifications. So I'd just like to share some findings with you. As you will see, if you download the report, it's huge. So I'm really just sort of touching the surface of a few aspects in today's session, but I'm hoping that it will be enough to probably pique your interest to dig a little bit deeper. There are 7 chapters in the report, and I'm recommending to people that, if you just want to get a sense of what this project is about, consider reading chapters 1, which is the intro, and also chapter 7, just to give you an overview of the overall project. And then each chapter is focusing on another area, whether it's knowledge and expertise, whether it's qualifications, whether it's CPD. And so then, depending on what your interest is, you can dig a little bit deeper there. Another aspect of the report that I felt was really important was in writing up each of the chapters on the different aspects that were identified in this project. I tried to write separate, discrete sections for each employee group under each of those areas, which does make it easier for someone who might, say, be a library tech to then be able to just cherry pick through the report for any aspects that are relevant to your work, your profession, your aspirations, your career progression, and so on. Okay, so in terms of, I'll give you just a brief overview of where those 693 respondents came from. This is a breakdown by state and territory. We had pretty decent representation from most states and territories, and in actual fact, ACT, according to the population of states and territories, we did have greater input from ACT. In terms of school sector, we had just under half were from government schools. We had just over 35% from independent, the independent sector, and 22% from the Catholic sector. So we had fairly good representation across all 3 sectors, which was great. In terms of school type, the majority of people who completed the survey did actually work in either discretely in primary schools, K to 6, or I've actually used the term foundation. I use the Australian curriculum terminology for our school type. So we've got pre-foundation, we had foundation to 6, and then 7 to 10 or 7 to 12. And then we did have some combined primary sex. Most of those were coming from the independent and Catholic sector. In terms of school location, I guess there's probably comes as no surprise that the majority of respondents did actually come from capital cities in Australia, but we still had decent regional representation that has also provided us with some really valuable data about what school library staffing looks like in regional areas. In terms of the type of school library, the majority of those were single site libraries, but there were a number of multiple site libraries where you had anything from 2 to 4 school libraries. Some of those were all on the same site, whereas others may have been part of the same school, but they were maybe just physically located a little bit away. And we had 1 virtual library represented in this data set. In terms of the employee demographics, I'd just like to share an overview of some of this, because I think it's really interesting where we start to see once we started to analyse this data, it was interesting to see some of the trends that were coming out as a result of having our respondents identify themselves as working in one of these 5 employee groups. So we had good representation from those people that were being employed as teacher librarians. And we also had fairly significant representation from people working as library assistants and library techs, as well as librarians. And we had a handful of people who were teachers without a library qualification or teacher librarianship qualification, who are working in the school libraries. In terms of gender, I think this comes as no surprise to probably most of you that are here today, that the majority of respondents were female, with a small number of male respondents. I actually looked at the National Skills Commission and ABS data on those people working in libraries, in the broader library sector, and there was a little bit more male representation in terms of those people working in the broader LIS sector than there were in school libraries. In terms of age, now I find the age comparison, and I know it looks very busy on the screen, but all I'm trying to do here is just to provide this comparison across our teacher librarian, library tech, and library assistant respondents within this sample, to just show similar trends in terms of the age of those people working within the school library sector. So for those that might not be able to see this very well, the blue and the orange sectors from the bottom up to the left-hand side of each of these pie charts represents people who are working in school libraries who are of the age of 50 and over. So you can see with teacher librarians and librarians, library assistants and library techs that over 50%, in fact, closer to, for librarians, was closer to 2/3 of those working in school libraries are of the age of 50 and over. What is also important is looking at the age ranges of the 20 to 29 bracket, particularly in terms of teacher librarians and librarians where people are undertaking a university degree. There's a smaller representation of those people working or being employed as teacher librarians and librarians. If we look at the 2 charts down, the pie charts down on the bottom, we've got library techs on the left-hand side and library assistants on the right-hand side. We are seeing more representation of younger people who have trained as library techs, for example, under the age of 50. And we've also got, once again, a little bit more representation of those people in the 20 to sort of, 39 range there as well. But ultimately, I think this does confirm, and these age comparisons in the report I draw upon, once again, National Skills Commission ABS data. The school library sector has a far larger portion of people over the age of 50 working in the school library sector compared to the broader LIS sector. And in the report, I provide significant detailed analysis on some of the implications of this as well, which I welcome you to read. In terms of basis of employment, this was interesting as well. So we've got on one hand a fairly aging population of school library employees in Australia, but at the same time, the majority of the people who responded to this survey actually were employed in permanent positions. So this suggests that there's not a lot of movement within the school library sector, for those people that are seeking employment. So there was fixed term contracts in all shapes, sizes and forms, and there's quite a lengthy section in the report that details some of the issues around some of the fixed term contracts, and also some of the way that some library assistants and library techs in particular are being employed in permanent positions, but they're only being paid and employed during term time, not school holidays. Some people were being paid across the whole year. Other people were only being paid for the weeks they were working. So there are some problems that are in the report that we highlight in terms of what's happening in our sector, some of which are problematic. And obviously, ALIA, in partnership with other associations and education systems, really probably need to be having discussions about some of that, because there was some trends that are showing that particularly qualified librarians and library techs are actually being employed in positions beyond what they're qualified to do. So on the basis of employment, this is just showing you comparisons in terms of the 5 stakeholder groups in terms of the permanency versus casual fixed term contract. So there was a little bit more of the contract and casual work happening with our library tech and library assistant groups compared to the other groups that had professional qualifications of for the librarian teacher and teacher librarian groups. This is just a comparison between full-time and part-time employment across these employee groups too. And I think this is also symptomatic of, can lead to some of the issues that we're seeing with how people are being employed in the school library sector. A number of people who were teacher librarians and who were library techs and library assistants might have been employed in a full-time position, but in actual fact they were doing other duties that was actually cutting into their full-time 5-day-a-week position. For example, teacher librarians being expected to teach a number of classes outside of the library. There were library assistants and even library techs who were might be working some days in other positions within the school, and some of those positions, those contracts were negotiated that way, which was fine. But there were a number of people who provided feedback in our survey that said that while they were actually being paid and employed as a full-time employee of the school library, that there was a percentage of that their time was being used to fulfill other positions and needs within the school beyond the school library. So the report also details quite a bit of the sort of issues that we're facing there as well, that needs to be considered and addressed, really. In terms of positions and roles, this is, I think, one of the most interesting part of the report, actually, is looking at the positions and roles of those working in school libraries. So once again, this is just more of a providing more of a visual kind of comparison. But in the top 2 pie charts that we have on the screen here, you've already seen the top left one, which was the breakdown of respondents according to their employment category, whether they were being employed as a TL, a librarian, tech, or assistant, or teacher. On the top right-hand side, we provided a list of key position titles that were kind of representative of roles that people would be undertaking in the school library. And it was really interesting to see that with all of the position titles, as per the pie chart in the top right-hand corner, that there was a significant number of people that were being employed as teacher librarians working in the position of, say, head of library or as a library manager. The same with librarians. There was about 5% of those people were actually working in other positions that were kind of at a management level as well. Now, what I find really interesting, which probably represents these areas where I see within the school library sector as being problematic, and that's if you look at the bottom left-hand pie chart with library assistant titles, while those people that were being employed as library assistants, just over 50% of them had a title that was similar to library assistant or library officer. But if you look at the other titles, position titles in that pie chart, that is showing that there are a significant number of library assistants who are being employed as library assistants who are taking on roles other than what one would expect in a library assistant position. We do know that there are some states in Australia in particular where we are seeing an increasing number of library assistants being employed to actually run and manage the school library. And there's no teacher librarian being employed by some of those school systems. So to me, this pie chart suggests there are problems, and we actually detail a number of those in the report. So if you're a library assistant and you sort of feel that you might be asked to be doing things way beyond your what you're being paid to do, you might find that some of the commentary that's in the report useful in terms of putting forward an argument. I do know, for example, in Western Australia, there are 2 levels of school officer positions. And if in fact you're a person working in the library as a school officer, level 1, if you're actually taking on more responsibility, you actually can apply for a school officer level 2 position. So you're earning more money to sort of represent the kind of leadership role that you might be doing within the context of a school officer position. And the same applies, I think, in Queensland. So that's just there are a number of issues, I think, where ALIA could start to have conversations with education systems about how systems are employing people to work in their school libraries. The library tech pie chart in the bottom right is also very interesting, where you've got, these are people that were being employed as library techs, but a number of those people were actually taking on other roles. So employed as a library tech, but actually taking on a librarian position or role within the school library, and even moving towards library manager or being head of library. So there's a lot of discussion in the report about the challenges that we are seeing now in the school library sector as a result of this, including what we call position creep, where people are being employed at a lower level, but they're expected to actually be performing duties beyond what they're being paid to do. And I think one of the challenges here as well is that it just makes it even more confusing for your school community to understand what role people are actually fulfilling in the school library. And that's where I think sometimes teacher librarians can get very frustrated when they see that, you know, students and teachers and parents just assume that, you know, the library assistant working in the school library has the same qualification as a teacher librarian or a librarian working in the library. So there needs to be, I think, a more formal process that allows people working in these positions to clearly show that distinction between the positions. In terms of the librarians, the data that we collected about librarians, I think, was probably another problematic area, in that a number of people that had a full library qualification were being employed as library techs or library assistants, for example. So there were some challenges in there, and the report actually details quite a lot of the issues that relate to that. In comparison, the teacher librarian position titles, that's not that the data that we collected about teacher librarian position titles was really, there was no significant kind of issues or concerns there really, although feedback from teacher librarians were from the teacher librarian employee group did talk about concerns about the erosion of their position, and often in some school systems where once a teacher librarian retired or left, the school was then not employing a new teacher librarian to fill that position. They were looking at other ways of trying to fill a position for someone to be working in the library. In terms of qualifications and pathways, this was really interesting as well. This diagram is just showing the teacher librarian, those people that had a teacher librarian qualification, or those people working, sorry, as a teacher librarian, and what this diagram is showing what qualification they had. So overall, the majority of people who were working as teacher librarians who completed this survey did actually have a dual qualification in teaching and librarianship. There was a group of people that were qualified teachers that didn't have a library qualification, but a number of those people actually were currently enrolled in CSU's Master of Education in Teacher Librarianship course. So they were well on their way to gaining their qualification. And there were a few other people there who had said that they were being employed as a teacher librarian, but they didn't have the qualification as ALIA guidelines suggest. In terms of positions held by those with a librarian qualification, I found this a really interesting cohort, really, because we are seeing a trend, particularly in the independent sector, where independent schools are employing a librarian as a library manager or a head of library over employing a teacher librarian. Now, there's some challenges there, obviously, because the sort of remuneration that a qualified teacher librarian as a teacher gets is considerably more than what a qualified librarian would be getting within the school library sector. So once again, in the report, there's a lot of discussion about the issues that people are facing as qualified librarians working within the school library sector. I realize I'm going to be running out of time, so I'm going to zip through this. What I've got with each of these slides, I've actually got a set of commentary with each slide deck. So I'll make sure that that's packaged up for people so that you can go through these slides, and there's matching commentary from the report that supports each of these slides. But I will just mention once again, the library assistant employee group, that is a problematic sector because we're actually seeing a significant number of people working as library assistants have absolutely no formal qualification, library qualification. And what that does show, though, there's lots of opportunity for ALIA and other associations to really be promoting within school education sectors and systems about providing some qualifications, some education and training and some CPD for those people working as library assistants. So to me, I see those working as library assistants in schools, there's I think, a fairly significant market there for CPD in particular, even for basic knowledge and skills in the area. We were also interested in the micro-credential sort of pathway to a qualification, and just under 50% of respondents did say they were interested. And on the right-hand side of this slide, it's just showing overall across all employee groups the kind of degrees and diplomas and certificates that people would be interested in gaining as a result of completing some micro units. there's a whole section written in the report about this. So if you're interested in looking at that, I think there's lots of potential to have conversations with universities and TAFEs about the value of introducing some kind of micro-credentialed pathway approach. So in terms of considerations for the future with regarding to qualifications and framework, there are a number of suggestions in the report to try to broaden employment for our sector. Given that, if we're trying to attract some younger people into the school library sector, I think there's lots of potential in terms of targeting careers, counsellors and advisors in school sectors to try to highlight the interest, the value, in working in a school library, particularly targeting school leavers. I think there's lots of opportunity for vet traineeship programs. I can see that school libraries could, become quite a good place for traineeships to occur in the LIS sector or for the LIS sector. And a number of people who were working in school libraries were saying that they were using their employment in the school library while they were doing some training to actually provide them with some experience to then try to move into other, to try to gain employment in other libraries, such as public libraries, national state libraries, special libraries, university libraries, and so on. Okay. In terms of professional development, I'll just briefly, there's a whole chapter on this, but I'll just briefly highlight overall across all of the 5 employee groups, there was a list of 13 key areas where, whether you're a library assistant or a TL or a librarian or a library tech, these areas were all identified by these employee groups as being CPD topics that they would like to see some professional learning provided in the future. The selecting and evaluation of Indigenous resources sort of floated to the top across all employee groups, which I thought was that was really good to see, that there was a lot of interest in that, as well as the diversity and inclusion and equity in school libraries. So they were overall across our collective group of respondents, of our 693 respondents, those 13 topics were identified as being important to all groups. So in a way that can help ALIA, for example, look at ways that they could be developing some programs that would be of interest to not just teacher librarians, but all employee groups in school libraries. And then the report also actually provides far more detail about the targeted PL for each of the employee groups. Each of the participants were actually asked to identify whether they were interested in an introductory level, intermediate level, or advanced level of treatment for each of these topics. And so in brackets after each of these, this is showing the level. So in terms of teacher librarians, I think it's no surprise that people were asking for CPD at that intermediate to advanced level. With the teachers who didn't have a library qualification, there was more breadth in terms of the level of treatment. So a number of people still wanted introductory treatment to some things. When you look at the list here for teachers, you can see that a lot of that would be covered by those teachers gaining their say Master of Education, Teacher Librarianship qual. In terms of librarians, once again, most of the treatment was intermediate to advanced, given that these people were already had a qualification and were looking for top-up CPD. In terms of library techs, there were a range of issues there, but with the library techs, a lot of that was moving more towards the technical aspect of their work. And with library assistants, I think that comes as no surprise too. There are some basic aspects here where I think that the topics that were identified by a significant number of people working as library assistants who didn't have any LIS training. So I'd just like to finish with the recommendations, which are detailed at the end of Chapter 7 in the report. There are 5 recommendations for the Professional Pathways Initiative in terms of supporting the school library sector. The first recommendation was for ALIA to consider establishing a specific sort of working party that could help inform further initiatives that were related to the school library sector, based on a lot of the findings and issues that and trends that have been reported on as a result of this project. The need to clearly articulate professional pathways for the school library sector. There are a number of people who had completed TAFE certificates, then a diploma, then they wanted to become a teacher librarian, and they did not have access to clearly articulated pathways very early on when they were interested in exploring a career in the school library sector. These align to, I think these recommendations align fairly closely to the recommendations that the Pathways Board have developed as a result of the Professional Pathways Technical Report. I think that there's lots of scope here in working with educators to develop new professional pathways, and also contextualising accredited courses for the school library sector. There's quite a bit of detail in the report where feedback from people have said, look, as a librarian, I just wasn't, while I did my library degree or while I did my library tech diploma, there wasn't enough information in my course that provided me with what I needed for the school library context. There might have been a lot of public library or university examples in the curriculum, but not enough school library sector examples. So I think there's some scope there, and there's quite a bit of detail about that in the report. Developing an employer engagement strategy with school education systems, I think that's really critical for us in terms of the future of people working in school libraries, particularly those who have a full qualification as a teacher librarian or a librarian or even a library tech. And there just needs to be more conversation with between ALIA and other associations with those who are employing people to work in school libraries. And then recommendation 5 really fits quite tightly with the sort of professional pathways framework work that's currently going on in terms of looking at the professional identity and strengthening the professional identity of those working in school libraries, the concept of a team and the concept of the importance of each of those employee groups contributing to and having value in being part of a school library team is really important. And encouraging more professional engagement. There's a lot of people who are working in the school library sector who currently aren't engaging at all with other people who are doing a similar job to them. And those working as school library assistants in particular are a group that aren't really getting access to professional learning, for example, whether it's within their system or whether it's them then seeking some kind of training or CPD externally. So I'd like to thank you for coming today and checking in to see how we've progressed with this aspect of ALIA's Professional Pathways Initiative. Once again, here's a QR code if you'd like to check out the full report. And Trish, I'm wondering if there are any questions.
You'll be happy to know, Lynn, there's a lot of questions.
Okay.
And people, please do continue to put questions into the chat. Firstly, I want to say thank you, Lynn. That's incredibly, it sounds like a really thorough presentation, but I know actually this is very much skimming the surface of that report. So I do encourage everybody to pick up that QR code and go and have a look at that report if you have time. We've got a couple of questions sitting here, and a couple of them have sort of been looking at that finding you found around what people were qualified to do and what their title was doing. And I just wondered if you had any further insights as to how deep that went. Is it just what people are being called, or do we have some information about what additional duties or responsibilities people might be being called upon to do?
Yeah, look, we do. So in the report that we do actually have some a number of examples of what's happening there. And clearly, I know Margaret Merger has also talked about position creep, or she calls it job creep, within the particularly for teacher librarians. But I think the data that we collected for this project clearly shows that there are a number of people who are being employed at a level that is far less than what they're qualified to do. And so they might be getting paid as a library assistant or a library tech, but they could be a fully qualified librarian, for example. And so there's issues there in terms of, underemployment, really, in terms of someone's qualification. That there are other challenges there too, where we had librarians saying, look, I was employed as a librarian in this school, but leadership is also expecting me to take on a teaching role. And so there's some challenges there, and in the report we do detail some of the issues around that. So that's problematic. That's problematic for the librarians who are being employed as a librarian, but then there's an expectation that they're going to be teaching classes. There was issues around librarians really feeling that they needed training in terms of sort of the curriculum. So there was demand for CPD from that group in particular, to do with curriculum, to do with assessment. And then as a result of that, you can see that there would be, from a teacher librarian perspective, if you're a fully qualified teacher librarian, you're going to be concerned about that, because it means that schools are electing to employ someone as a librarian, but them having the school having an expectation that they're going to be taking on the teaching role as well, without actually being receiving the remuneration that they would if they actually were being employed as a teacher librarian.
I think that that very much actually leads into a comment we've got here from Michael that sort of talks about the fact that his school's only got the budget to employ him for 1 day a week, and sort of saying, at what point is the issue less talking to schools and more about talking to state governments about school funding models?
Yeah, look, there's challenges there because it's different within and across sectors. So there are some public education systems in some states and territories who are actually, New South Wales does have a policy to do with that, but there are other states that don't. And in the report, I do detail a number of issues that have currently been happening in terms of union activity to try to address some of those challenges. Can I say also, though, the other concern was there were some people who might have been employed when we were asking about their employment as a full-time or part-time person. There was also concerns there where there were some people who might be employed for 2 days a week as a library tech, and then they were coming in and volunteering in the school library for another 2 days because of the workload. So I think it would be really helpful to actually start collecting some vignettes and scenarios like that to really try to raise people's awareness, particularly in the broader community, about some of the challenges there, because I think traditionally volunteer labour has been used in school libraries, but it's really problematic when you start to see some people feeling that they need to be coming to work for another day or two to try to keep on top of the workload and not get paid for it. So there are some issues there.
And I have to say, Lynn, I think the coming back and volunteering is probably the most egregious example of job creep that you could find, which beautifully, seamlessly runs me into a question from Holly that sort of says, she'd love to hear you expand upon strategies about how staff can have a conversation to push back against job creep, both maybe in higher duties and in time.
Yeah, look, I think there's a fair bit of detail in the report that I think someone could kind of, arm themselves with a fairly strong argument. I think one of the challenges here too is that education systems within different states and territories just operate so differently. So there's no one size fits all sort of solution to this. Unfortunately, I really feel that that's why there is that recommendation about the employer engagement strategy, because I think we really need to be working, one-on-one with each education system within each state and territory to really get a good sense of what's happening there. Now, I know in WA, we've got 2 champions who are working in the school library support area with the WA Department of Education. They're people that have library training themselves, and they've got a huge number of people being employed as library assistants in the public education system in WA. And these people don't have training. So there are some big issues there. And I just think that we have got, I have, been careful in trying to say to people, look, this is a snapshot. This survey and with the focus groups that we've done as part of this ALIA Professional Pathways in School Libraries project, it's just really giving us a snapshot of what is happening within the school library sector within and across states and territories. It's certainly not representative. It's not a census. I know the School Library Coalition is still having conversations about, how we could possibly, gain the support and the funding to support such a census to really get a good idea of what's happening more deeply across and within the sector. So I think that this is a really important piece of work that ALIA has invested in, and to me, I sort of see this as just the beginning of sort of, a new kind of, wave of trying to, push the agenda and try to have conversations with those who are employing people to work in school libraries.
Thanks, Lynn. And I will editorialise to say that I'm a huge shout out to the work of the Schools Coalition, which I know Lynn's part of with her School Library Association of New South Wales hat on, and Ali is very much a party of, and I can see many people on this call who are also involved in the School Libraries Coalition. I think that work that we are doing across the country to coordinate and organise is incredibly important. And I know that probably every single person on this call is well aware of the Students Need School Library campaign, which is also tied to that School Coalition. And I can see on the call here, Holly was here before, who's obviously our fantastic person who ringleads that. But if you haven't checked in for a while, or you can think of more people to share that campaign through, I think, the action starts with us. So my editorializing hat on, I would strongly encourage everybody to keep tabs on the Students Need School Libraries campaign, and please think about how you can be actively involved and actively sharing that, because we do need all of the voices in this conversation. I've got one more very different sort of technical question. Do you have any insights into how qualifications in the school library sector might compare to those in the university library sector? Or is there any work you know of in that area?
Okay, let me get this right. So the question is asking in terms of
The
training.
question exactly was, it'd be interesting to know how roles and qualifications in school libraries compare with university libraries.
Yeah, well, I don't know of research that would be comparing those two sectors. But anecdotally, I would think that in the university library sector that we would be seeing an erosion of professional positions and probably having more paraprofessional positions or other positions coming into that sort of, that team. But it would be interesting. It would be interesting to see. But I would think that university library teams would be shrinking, and my guess would be probably a lot of that could have happened quite rapidly during COVID, when you had universities closed down as well. Can I just say the one thing that I think is really important in terms of this body of work for the broader Professional Pathways Initiative, and that is that we really need as a school library sector to really try to work together. I know that traditionally we would have people who have got a dual qualification as a teacher librarian, and they feel that every person working in a school library needs to be dually qualified. Well, the reality is that that's not the case. But we do, I think, every person working in the school library sector has a place and has a role and has a contribution. And that last recommendation about professional identity is really important, because we're talking about our collective school library teams in terms of our qualified teacher librarians, qualified librarians, library techs, and also those people who are working in paraprofessional positions and needing support. So I think that we're at a point in time where I think it's really important to have some of these open conversations and try to actually come together to collectively support each of those employee groups within the school library sector.
I completely agree, Lynn. I'm hoping everybody's feeling inspired and cooperative after this. At the end of the day, I think what's at stake is much too large to risk getting this wrong for much longer. I've got one final question, and apologies to anyone whose questions we haven't got to. We will, anything that I haven't managed to see in chat that's just bumped in, we will get Lynn to give us a line to throw into the email, which we send out after this.
Sure.
Final question is, it says, how do we enhance people's agency in grasping ways they might advance their professional qualifications? Think of one key or two key things that would be useful.
Actually, look, we detail quite a bit in the report about this, because people were asked about their career aspirations, and there's a whole section in the report on career aspirations, and it was really interesting to see. People, I think one of the biggest challenges is making sure that people out there in the community who might be interested in working in school libraries in some capacity has access to information about the types of roles and positions that can be filled. And I think that's where the Professional Pathways initiative with ALIA is really important, in terms of getting that message out more broadly in terms of career advice and as well as career progression advice. And whether or not that's just a case of, even starting off with, developing a series of infographics that provide pathways. I know that with the Pathways Project, Trish, you've already got some scenarios of people that are working in the broader LIS sector that are coming with a whole lot of knowledge and skills from other professions, but they still obviously they're learning on the job, they're completing other CPD, And so I think that probably, I feel that this work that we've just completed here is really an opportunity to we use that as a launching pad to just really start to try to bed down some better articulation of professional pathways for people working within the sector. And I think that both TAFEs and universities have an important part to play in that conversation.
Definitely.
And promoting those pathways. Yeah.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Lynn. And I mean, that's a beautiful sort of moment for me to assure everybody that, Ali is incredibly grateful to the work of Lynn and the work of the expert reference group that supported her and all of the various people who were involved in the project in part of the focus groups, responding to the survey, providing information. So a huge thank you to everybody for that. ALIA and the ALIA board are incredibly interested in this project and in making sure that we support it. And a shout out to our ALIA board member, Catherine, who is here today joining us. Thank you very much. I know this is a personal interest for Catherine, so she's been very involved. We will, as you would all see, there were recommendations within that report from Lynn, and ALIA will be responding to those recommendations in due course. So we're really grateful for them, and I think it's given us a great platform to go forwards. As I've mentioned, this whole conversation is being recorded and we will circulate this afterwards. I would just like once again to extend my thanks to you all for joining us today. And again, a huge thank you to Lynn. It's a fantastic bit of research and an incredibly insightful webinar you've just delivered. So thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. And I'm more than happy to, if people want to reach out to me, if you've got any questions, you can also email education@alia.gov.au, and I'm sure that Trish and Jackie can forward those to me as well.
More than happy to.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks all.
Take care.